Abandonment to Divine Providence, Part 14. Letter 3. The Illusions of the Devil. To Sister Charlotte Elizabeth Boussier de Monthereau, 1735. On interior troubles voluntarily entertained and weakness. My dear sister, for several days past I have had so many letters to write, either for this country or for France, that I have not been able to read your long account. I do not disguise from you that it seemed to me very useless, because God had given me the grace to thoroughly understand your state without me having the trouble to read all this. However, I have read the most essential part, that against which you have put a particular mark, and it has only confirmed the opinion I had formed of you some time ago. Excuse me, my dear sister, if I insist on the same direction that I have always hitherto given you. Until now you have derived great benefit from having followed it. Why then allow yourself to be misguided by the illusions of the devil? I am not speaking to you at random, but with full conviction. Do then believe me, and prove, by your docility, that the confidence with which you honor me is not a vain pretense. If you really have a good will, if you are sincerely and earnestly resolved to belong to God, you ought to make every effort to maintain yourself in peace, in order not to give the lie to the message of the angels. Peace to men of good will. But you must expect that Satan will exert every effort to prevent you from acquiring a peace so desirable. I know that, unfortunately, he has but too well succeeded up to now. The greatest evil in your soul at present is that of anxiety, uneasiness, and interior agitation. This malady is, thank God, not incurable, but as long as it remains unhealed, it cannot but be even more dangerous than painful to you. Interior disturbance renders the soul incapable of listening to and following the advice of the divine spirit, of receiving the sweet and delightful impressions of his grace, of applying itself to pious exercises and to exterior duties. It is the same with such sick and afflicted souls as with bodies enfeebled by fever, which cannot accomplish any serious task until delivered from their malady. And as there is a certain analogy between them, there is also some resemblance between the remedies to be used. The health of the body can be restored by three means: obedience to the physician, rest, and good food. These are, likewise, the three means of restoring peace and health to a soul that is agitated, sick, and almost in agony. The first condition for its cure is obedience, a childlike blind obedience founded on the principle that God, having authorized his priests to guide us, cannot allow these souls to be deceived who, on this account, abandon themselves blindly to their guidance. Before all things, therefore, make your virtue consist in the renunciation of your own judgment, and in a humble and generous intention of believing and doing all that your director judges before God to be expedient. If you are animated with this spirit of obedience, you will never allow yourself voluntarily to entertain thoughts opposed to what has been enjoined you, and you will take good care not to give in to the inclination to examine and scrutinize everything. If, however, in spite of yourself, some thoughts contrary to obedience enter your mind, you must reject them, or better still, despise them as dangerous temptations. The second remedy for your complaint is rest and peace for your soul. To acquire this, you must first of all desire it ardently, and to pray to God earnestly for it, and then work with all your might to acquire it. If you wish to know how to set about this task, I will tell you. Be very careful not to allow any thoughts which would bring about uneasiness, sadness, or depression to remain in your mind. These thoughts are, in one sense, more dangerous than temptations to impurity. You must, therefore, let them alone, without dwelling on them. Despise them, and let them fall like a stone into the sea. Resist them by fixing your mind on contrary ideas, and above all by making aspirations suitable for the occasion, with sighs and interior groanings accompanied by acts of humility. But this struggle, while being energetic and generous, must also be quiet, tranquil, and peaceful, because if it were to be restless, unhappy, ill-humored, and wild, the remedy would be worse than the disease. In the second place, avoid in your actions, whether exterior or interior, all eagerness, hurry, and natural activity. Accustom yourself, on the contrary, to speak, to walk, to pray, and to read quietly, slowly, without overexerting yourself, no matter for what, not even to repulse the most frightful temptations. You must remember that if these temptations are displeasing to you, that is the best sign that you have not consented to them. As long as the free will feels nothing but horror at and hatred for the objects presented to the imagination in these temptations, it is evident that it does not in any way consent to them. Keep yourself, therefore, in peace in the midst of these temptations, as you have done in other trials. First, it only remains then to cure the weakness resulting from the fever which torments a soul in trouble. For that a strengthening diet is necessary, that is to say, to read good books, and to get accustomed to read very slowly with frequent pauses, more to try and take an interest in what you read than to make use of the intellect in reflections on it. Remember the wise saying of Fenelon, "The words we read are like the bark of the tree, but the interest we take in them is like the sap which feeds and fattens the soul." We must act as regards the spiritual nourishment as gluttons and sensualists act with regard to their feasts, which they taste in remembrance and enjoy after having swallowed them. Second, We must only speak on useful and edifying subjects, and with those who are most capable of leading us to God by their holy conversation. Third, never seek consolation from creatures by useless intercourse. This is an essential matter for those who are suffering interior trials. God, who sends them for our good, desires that we should bear them without going elsewhere for consolation, but to him, and he claims the right to settle the moment when such consolation should be given us. Fourth, we must apply ourselves, each according to his or her capacity and attraction to interior prayer, but without intense application or strain, keeping very quietly in the holy presence of God, addressing him occasionally by some interior act of adoration, repentance, confidence, or love. If, however, it is not possible to make such acts, we must be content with the good desire of doing so. For, whether for good or evil, desire is equivalent to an act in the sight of God. Bossuet, somewhere in his works, very truly says, desire is, with regard to God, what the voice and words are with regards to men. We ask and return thanks by the desires we have, which say everything, and make our petitions known to God much more distinctly than any words can do, or even those interior acts which are called particular and formal. This is what gave rise to the saying that a cry uttered only in the depths of the heart is the same in the sight of him who sounds all hearts, as a cry that pierces the heavens. Fifth, it is necessary to put this manner of praying into practice, not only at morning devotions, but also during the whole day in a quiet, easy, tender, and affectionate manner, by frequently raising the heart to God, or by an interior attention to the divine presence. To gain greater facility, you might review in the morning nearly every event, both interior and exterior, likely to occur during the day, and ask yourselves, if I make myself in such a circumstance, or such a position, what shall I say to God? What act should I make? And if, when the time arrives, you are prevented from carrying out your good intention, you can be content to adhere to them, even if only indistinctly, and to lay before God your inability. Finally, the best food for the soul consists in willing in all and for all what God wills. Or, in other words, to adhere to all designs of divine providence in every imaginable circumstance, whether interior or exterior, health or sickness, aridity, distractions, weariness, disgusts, temptations, etc., and to accept all this very heartily, saying, Yes, my God, I will everything. I accept all, I sacrifice all to you, or at any rate I wish to do so, and ask for this help, grace, and strengthen my weakness. In the most fearful temptations say to him, My God, preserve me from sin in this matter. but I willingly accept as much confusion to my pride and interior abjection and humiliation as you will, and long as you will, unite my will to yours. The most uneasy and enfeebled soul could not fail to recover its lost peace and joy if it adopted these means for regaining them. Letter 4. Interior Troubles. To the same person, in 1755. If my letter distressed you, my dear sister, I will say to you with St. Paul, that I rejoice not, indeed, at your affliction, but at the good effect it has produced. It is good to recognize that one has been culpable in many ways, not in order to reproach oneself in a hard, bitter, angry, and disturbed manner, but to humble oneself quietly and peacefully without contempt or bitterness. You do not consider yourself disobedient, you say, in relating to me quite frankly your fears and doubts. That is not the question, my dear sister, but what is that you continue to cling to your fears and doubts. You study them too much, instead of despising them and abandoning yourself entirely to God, as I have preached to you for a long time past. Without this happy and holy abandonment, you will never enjoy a solid peace full of absolute confidence in God alone, through Jesus Christ. But, I ask you again, what have you to fear in this abandonment, especially after such evident signs of the great mercy of God towards you? You are endeavoring to find help in yourself and your works, and to satisfy your conscience, as if your works gave your conscience greater security and stronger support than the mercy of God and the merits of Jesus Christ, and as though they could not deceive you. I pray God to enlighten you, and to give you a change of heart about this matter so essential to you. You say that I should feel distressed and surprised if you laid bare to me all that you experience. This is exactly what people in your state so often say to me, people with whom I am not so well acquainted with as with you. Here is my answer to you, and others like you. The keen perception of faults and imperfections is the grace suitable to this state, and it is a very precious grace. Why? First, because this clear view of our miseries keeps us humble, and even sometimes inspires us with a wholesome horror and a holy fear of ourselves. Secondly, because this state, apparently so miserable and so desperate, gives occasion to a heroic abandonment into the hands of God. Those who have gauged the depths of their own nothingness can no longer retain any kind of confidence in themselves, nor trust in any way to their works in which they discover nothing but misery, self-love, and corruption. This absolute distrust and complete disregard of self is the source from which alone flow these delightful consolations of souls wholly abandoned to God, and form their inalterable peace, holy joy, and immovable confidence in God only. Oh, if you but knew the gift of God, the value, merit, peace, power, and holy assurance of salvation hidden in this state of abandonment, you would soon be delivered from all your fears and anxieties. But you imagine you will be lost directly you think of abandoning yourself. And yet the most efficacious means of salvation is to practice this total and perfect abandonment. I have never yet come across any who have so set themselves against making this act of abandonment to God as you. Nevertheless, you will, necessarily, have come to it, at least at the hour of death, because, without an express revelation and assurance of eternal salvation, no one can be free from fear at the last moment, and therefore every one is absolutely compelled then to abandon themselves to the very great mercy of God. But, you say, if I had lived a holy life and performed some good works, I think I might think myself authorized to practice this abandonment, and to divest myself of my fears. An illusion, my dear sister. Such language can only have been inspired by your unhappy self-love, which desires to be able to trust entirely to itself, whereas you ought to place your confidence only in God and in the infinite merits of Jesus Christ. You have never really thoroughly fathomed this essential point, but always have stopped short to examine into your fears and doubts, instead of rising above them, and throwing yourself heart and soul into the hands of God, and upon his fatherly breast. In other words, you always want to have a distinct assurance based on yourself, in order to abandon yourself better. Most certainly this is anything but an abandonment to God, in complete confidence in him only, but, rather, a secret desire of being able to depend on yourself before abandoning yourself to his infinite goodness. This is to act like a state criminal who, before abandoning himself to the clemency of the king, wishes to be assured of his pardon. Can this be called depending on God, hoping only in God? Judge for yourself. And God has for so long a time been calling you to this state of abandonment and filial confidence. And you, instead of responding to this loving call, allow yourself to be tyrannized over and martyrized by a slavish fear. I greatly insist on this matter, because experience has taught me that this is the last battle of grace for souls in your state, the last step to take in forsaking self, and the one that costs the most. But it seems to me that no one has ever offered so much resistance as you. This proceeds from a very strongly rooted self-love, from a secret great presumption and confidence in yourself that, possibly, you may never have found out. For, mark well, that directly you are spoken to about this total abandonment to God, you feel a certain interior commotion as though all were lost, and as if you had been told to throw yourself, with your eyes shut, into an abyss. It seems a trifle, yet it is very much the contrary. For the greatest assurance of salvation in this life can only be obtained in this total abandonment. And this consists, as Fenelon says, in becoming thoroughly tired of and driven to despair of oneself, and made to hope only in God. Weigh well the force of these words, which at first sight seem so too strong and exaggerated. However, to bring you into this state of total abandonment, God has imparted to you two great graces. Firstly, a powerful attraction to induce you to place all your confidence in His very great mercy and goodness. Secondly, a great knowledge of, and a very penetrating insight into your miseries, weaknesses, perversity, powerlessness, to act well, etc., as if to say to you, you see that in this state you neither ought nor can, in any sort of way, depend on yourself, since you are nothing but a heap of corruption. Let me, then, have the care of you, and forsake yourself once for all, to depend only on me. But how shall I work out my salvation? What? Do you not understand that the most certain way of assuring this is to leave the care of it entirely to God, and to occupy yourself only with Him? As a man in the confidence of a great king leaves the question of recompense to him, and thinks only of the service and interests of his master, do you not think that, in acting in this generous manner, he would be better for himself than others who, more selfish, would think continually of what they might gain or obtain? But we are not commanded to think of ourselves, to enter into ourselves, to watch over ourselves. Yes, certainly, when beginning to enter the service of God in order to detach ourselves from the world, to forsake exterior objects, to correct the bad habits we have contracted, but afterwards we must forget ourselves to think only of God, forsake ourselves to belong to God alone. But as for you, you wish to remain always wrapped up in yourself, in your so-called spiritual interests. And God, to draw you out of this last resource of self-love, allows you to find nothing in yourself but a source of fears, doubts, uncertainty, trouble, anxiety, and depression. As though this God of all goodness said by this, forget yourself, and you will find in me only peace, spiritual joy, calmness, and an absolute assurance of salvation. I am the God of your salvation, and you can be nothing but the cause of your own destruction. But again you say, in this forgetfulness of self, far from correcting myself of my sins and imperfections, I do not even know them. An error, an illusion, ignorance. Never can you more clearly detect your faults than in the clear light of the presence of God. This is like an interior sunshine which, without necessitating a constant self-examination, makes us see and understand everything by a simple impression. In this way, better than in any other, all our defects and imperfections are gradually consumed like straw in a fire. And then how happy is the state at which you should have arrived a long time ago, and of which God has given, and still gives me frequent experience. As the human heart is a bottomless abyss of misery and corruption, the more the light of God penetrates into it, more sad and humiliating are the objects disclosed. But at the same time, these fresh disclosures, far from grieving the soul, console it in keeping it as an interior humility which it knows to be the foundation for the whole spiritual edifice. Far from disturbing its holy joy and casting it down, they inspire in it a solid confidence which it feels is placed in God alone, and that this confidence, according to Holy Scripture, has never been confounded. I have known and know how many souls that, following this method, are astonished to find that the more feeble, poor, and miserable they realize themselves to be, the greater becomes their confidence in God. The reason of this is that in proportion to our insight into our own misery and corruption, we will distrust ourselves and our confidence in God. God then imparts to those souls which have acquired this insight an absolute self-distrust joined to an entire confidence in Him, from which proceeds a total abandonment. These are the two strong springs of the spiritual life, and as long as you are in this state, you run no risk of your salvation. In abandoning all to God, therefore, we gain all in Him alone, and with profit to our souls. In this way we are delivered once and for all from these foolish self-examinations, fears, troubles, and uneasiness. In one word, from these tortures to which these self-engrossed souls condemn themselves, who wish to love God only out of self-love, who seek salvation and perfection, not so much to please God and to glorify them, but for their own interest and internal happiness. But, you will say, God commands us to desire our salvation and eternal felicity. Yes, without doubt, but according to, and in submission to ordaining of His will. Well, this is God's rule, which is necessary for you to understand thoroughly. God has created us for His own glory, and to do His will, and He could not have created us for any other purpose, for He owes this to Himself, and to His own sovereign dominion. But, as He is also infinitely merciful, He has so arranged that His creatures find their own interest and eternal happiness in doing His will. But see how this miserable self-love, which seeks itself above all else, reverses the order of things. We want first and principally to provide for our own interest, spiritual and eternal, and as for the glory of God, in our preoccupation we give Him only the second place. God sees this perversion with a jealous eye in souls. He has loaded with graces, and by which He desires to be loved with a pure and disinterested affection. And in order to make them return to this right order of things, He sends them troubles, fears, and interior agitation, seeking by means of these secret trials to destroy that self-love so harmful to them. He desires to induce them by degrees to think for themselves and their own interests, and to occupy themselves quietly with him alone by abandoning to him the care and management of their salvation. And this is the meaning of those words of Jesus Christ addressed to many holy souls. My daughter, think of me, and I will think of you. Busy yourself for my glory, and allow me to occupy myself with your interests and eternal welfare. As for us, what are we doing when we always worry and are so busy about ourselves? It is as though we said, Lord, what are you saying? I shall be lost if I do not continually think about my own soul, if I am not constantly asking myself how I stand with you, and what is going to become of me. This is what I am obliged to do without ceasing. As for what concerns your glory and your good pleasure, I can only think of them now and then. I hope I shall be able to occupy myself with them more habitually by the time I have conquered all my faults. And it is proved to me that I shall risk nothing by this constant attention to your divine interests. But first of all, I cannot now decide about it, for I should consider myself lost, and you wish me before all things to try and provide for the safety of my soul. To those of his spouses who address such language to him, this is the very clear and concise reply of our Lord in the Gospel. Whosoever loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world, keepeth it until life eternal. And in fact, I have never met with souls which have a greater horror for sin, more strength for the practice of virtue, or, or which make greater sacrifices for God when occasions arise than those souls which never seem to think of themselves but depend upon Him for everything, including their salvation. It is in this state that salvation is most certain, from which I conclude that not only scruples, but excessive fears, distressing doubts, spiritual trials, and bitterness of heart are caused by selfish feelings, a greater preoccupation about personal interests than about the glory of God, and a desire to please him out of pure love in all that should take place in our hearts. Since he is a sovereign good, love of him should take precedence of the charity we owe ourselves. And since he has promised to those who love him, and to love most those who love him only, we can be assured that in making use of all our powers to love him for himself, we shall regain with interest by this pure love all that we seem to have sacrificed. Therefore, far from losing, we gain all in abandoning ourselves entirely to God by love and confidence. The sight of that confused heap of weaknesses, miseries, unworthiness, and of all corruption, should never distress you. It is on this account that I say boldly, all is well, for I have never known a soul endowed with this keen insight, so humiliating to it, to whom it was not a most singular grace of God, nor who has not found in it, combined with a true knowledge of itself, that solid humility which is the foundation of all perfection. I have known, and do know, many saintly souls, who, for their sole possession, have that profound conviction of their misery, and are never so happy as when they feel themselves, as it were, engulfed in it. They then dwell in truth, and consequently in God, who is the sovereign truth. If you but knew how to walk before him, your head bowed in the spirit of self-effacement, you would find in it all that makes the spiritual life. It only remains to know how to preserve this spirit of peace and abandonment. Would to God that you to had the grace to pass all your time of prayer in this holy interior self-humiliation, engulfed in your misery, but in peace, submission, resignation, and confidence. Then I should say to you, stay as you are, and all is well. God will do the rest, and perhaps without you knowing or feeling that he is doing it. You are trembling over your state, and I am blessing God for it. I only wish you changed in one particular, and that is that your self-humiliation should be mingled with peace, submission, confidence, and abandonment, as I have just said. After that I should have no fear for you, not even about the laxness of which you tell me, which makes you walk like a crab. God will prevent great laxness, and it will allow small relaxations to keep you humble. St. Francis de Sales said it was a heroic virtue to rise again unceasingly without ever losing courage. God be praised in all and for all. Letter 5. On the love of one's neighbor. To Sister de Leeson, on the love of one's neighbor, 1735. I am not at all surprised at the friendship you have for your dear relative, and understand that it is due to her for many reasons. However, because by your own showing this affection disturbs you, and prevents you from giving your whole heart to God, there must needs be some irregularity about it. If you wish to sanctify it, and to render it altogether supernatural, this is what God demands of you. First, that you will not allow yourself to think about this person too often, nor to be engrossed by thoughts of her. There is moderation in all things. Second, that in the illness and affliction she has to endure, you will submit to them as a sacrifice you must make to God, and abandon yourself to him so that he may dispose of her, and of you in all things, and about all things according to his most holy will and loving good pleasure. You must know that in abandoning her thus to the will and care of divine providence, you render her, as well as yourself, the greatest possible service, since by this sacrifice you place her in the hands of God, who is infinitely good and infinitely powerful. We must certainly make use of our reasoning faculties in our trials, but, as a very holy and learned Christian has well said, we must not depend too much on this feeble faculty, which is stronger in opposition to what is good than in overcoming evil. It is religion, and the grace we obtain through humble prayer, which can sustain us. Sadness, depression, interior rebellion when our relatives suffer from various causes, taking rise in a too affectionate disposition, will be a grand occasion of virtue and merit to us, if, endeavoring to raise ourselves by love above our natural feelings, we understand that all has to be sacrificed to the adorable and most holy will of God. Do we not know that nothing can happen in this world without his permission, and that he has arranged everything for the greater good of those who submit to him, or at least who desire to acquire and to practice this submission? If we could only understand the value of this virtue, of all the means of salvation, this is, together with the fulfillment of the divine precepts, the most universal and the most infallible. Nothing more is required to sanctify most people and to lighten for them the trials of life. A wise pagan thought in this way when he said, if one has a sensitive nature, and is accustomed to foster in oneself what the world calls refined and generous sentiments, it is no easy matter to cure oneself of thinking too much about the family honor, and of taking too great an interest in family affairs, and also of being too much moved by every incident affecting those to whom we are most tenderly attached. It is necessary to pray much about this, and also to reflect how to combat it. Firstly, to reflect on the uselessness of our worries and our feelings, and on the harm they do themselves, as much to the bodily health as to the welfare of the soul. Secondly, to combat it by refraining from frequent, lengthy, and earnest thoughts on the subject, and by sacrificing and abandoning it entirely to God, in spite of the pangs the heart must endure from the violence of such sacrifices. Consider that, after all, there is only one thing necessary, and that provided that this great affair succeeds, everything else must be as God pleases. These feelings are quickly overcome, or rather, they are so trifling and paltry that they pass like shadows, to return no more. Let us act like a worldly people when they have to attend to business of the utmost importance, on which depend their honor, their life, their property, in fact everything, as they think. They have nothing else in their minds, day or night, but this important business, and neglect everything else as being nothing in comparison. As Jesus Christ has said, we must learn from the children of this world, who are wiser in their generation than the children of light. Remember that what help to save us is not exterior solitude nor retirement, for these can be had even in the world, but an interior withdrawal and solitude of the mind and the heart. Of the mind, by banishing superfluous cares and thoughts, and by endeavoring to make God the absorbing occupation of the heart, by lamenting its defects, by humbling it and frequently sighing after God, and by detaching it gradually from the creature to attach it solely to the Creator. He is the supreme truth, and nothing has any reality apart from him. Consequently, purely temporal interests, the business, the honors, pleasures, or sufferings of this lower world, are naught but shadows and phantoms. They appear to exist, but in reality are nothing. Letter 6, on Attachments. To Sister Anne Marguerite Baudet de la Bolliere, on attachment too keenly felt. My very dear daughter in Jesus Christ, I cannot thank God enough for this great desire of giving you yourself to him without reserve, that he has bestowed on you with the courage with which inspires you to make so many little sacrifices, and to moderate even the most harmless attachments. Oh, my dear sister, how thoroughly God has enlightened you about this, and how many dangers you will escape if you are faithful in following this light. We, unhappily, find only too many who, making profession of piety, are caught in this snare, and thus prevented from making any progress. With the excuse that there is no sin in, in the attachments they allow themselves, they give themselves up to them without scruple, and thus place an impenetrable barrier to the grace and the communications of God. He desires to fill and inflame their hearts with his pure love. But how can he do so as long as those hearts are distracted by foolish amusements, filled with a miserable love for some creature? You know what a dangerous snare this was for Saint Teresa, and, in truth, after such an example, you cannot be too much on your guard. Go on, then, detaching yourself more and more, and I assure you that in proportion as your detachment becomes more complete, you will feel more drawn to God, to prayer, recollection, and the practice of every virtue. For when the heart is empty in this way, God fills it, and then one can do everything easily and pleasantly, because all is done out of love, and that, you know, makes all things easy and sweetens all bitterness. Letter 7, Personal Attachments. My dear sister, allow me to tell you in all sincerity a fear that makes me anxious about you. It seems to me that your too frequent intercourse with the members of your numerous family, and with other people from outside, raises a serious obstacle to your advancement. Take care that, While trying to do good to others, you do no harm to yourself. Although I am obliged by my vocation to have more communication with the world than you, I assure you nevertheless that I find it very good for my soul to keep these communications within bounds. Since I came here, I have only made necessary visits, and try as much as possible to avoid receiving them. To those who come to me, I speak only of God, of salvation, and of eternity. This is the rule laid down by Saint Ignatius, and one which he declared suited him well. If people like this kind of conversation, they will profit by it, and their visit will not have been a waste of time. If they do not care for it, they will not come again, or at any rate not so often, and then I shall have more time left me for my priestly duties. It is useless to expect to make any progress as long as your mind is filled with news from outside, and your heart preoccupied with temporal affairs. The first condition for the interior life is recollection. I cannot urge you too strongly to restrict your communications and to follow the plan of St. Ignatius about those that you think you ought to retain. This plan is better suited to a religious, who is obliged by her vocation to keep secluded, than to other people. Far from being surprised, people in the world cannot but be edified at the fidelity with which she conforms her conduct to her vocation. On the contrary, if by these useless communications with people in the world she frequented society too much, she would only scandalize them, and would also lose all those graces which she might have acquired by her communications with God. Letter 8. On Natural Activity. To Sister Marie Henriette de Bousmard. On Natural Activity. I wish, my dear sister, that you were able to understand well all the harm that the excessive activity of your nature, unless completely under the rule and direction of grace, will infallibly cause you. This is one of those defects that the world mistakes for virtues, but which is none the less disastrous to the soul in its progress in the path of sanctity. Natural activity is the enemy of abandonment, without which, as I have often told you, there can be no real perfection. It prevents, obstructs, and spoils all the operations of grace, and substitutes, in the soul which succumbs to it, the impulsion of the human spirit for that of the divine spirit. In fact, there is no doubt that the impetuosity with which we give ourselves up to good works proceeds from a hidden source of self-confidence, and a thoughtless presumption that makes us imagine that we are what we are doing or can do great things. How much more modest and reserved we should be if we were thoroughly penetrated with the undoubted truth that we have nothing of our own, and are utterly powerless to do anything good, but only powerful for evil. To cure and to tear up by the root an evil so fruitful in imperfections, and even in sins, requires much time and much trouble. These are the means I most recommend to you. First, to be thoroughly convinced by past and present experience of your own weakness and misery, in order to distrust more and more your own works, even to the length of feeling a kind of horror to them. Second, to repress your excessive exterior activity by performing all your actions without eagerness or hurry, quite gently and quietly, as St. Francis de Sales advises. Third, to do the same in all your spiritual exercises, and always to mortify the initial eagerness with which you start any good work, no matter what it may be, to undertake it only under the influence of the pure Spirit of God, and by the peaceful impulse of grace. Fourth, when you pray and hold intercourse with God interiorly, try to avoid all sensible ardor, all that fiery fervor and excitement of the imagination characteristic of beginners. To effect this, follow the advice of St. Francis de Sales, and manage so that all your interior acts shall flow and be drawn from and distilled by the highest point of the mind, so that you hardly feel that you are praying and making acts. Far from these acts being, on this account, less fruitful, they make a deeper impression on the soul and penetrate more deeply and more pleasantly into the heart. Fifth, when you feel, however confusedly, that something is acting in your soul, the stronger this impression is, the more necessary it is to keep quiet and still, and as though in a state of inaction, so that you may not spoil all by interfering unseasonably. Sixth, when God makes you experience certain consolations or strong emotions, instead of giving yourself up to them with a sensual avidity, behave with the reserve and modesty of a mortified person invited to a great feast. Seventh, during the day let the principal interior occupation be what is called simple interior waiting, silent, peaceful, and entirely resigned. And do not think that this is idleness, a waste of time, or in any way useless, because, as a beggar who waits the whole day long at a rich man's gate, or at the church door, is by no means idle, but much occupied interiorly with his own misery, his wants, and continual necessities. So, in the same way, a soul in this simple waiting before God is very much occupied interiorly, and in this simple manner is making the following acts: of faith in the presence of God, of adoration before this great God, whose infinite power and mercy it acknowledges, of self-distrust, of profound humility in thinking itself incapable of anything, of desire for the holy operations of God, of hope, since one does not wait for what one does not expect to receive, and of abandonment to divine providence in regard to all his gifts and operations. And although these acts may not be accurately performed, specified, nor simple, yet they are none the less there, at the bottom of the heart and God at least sees them in our desires and in our state of preparation. Now, as you are aware, our wishes and desires, even if only begun to be formed, are to God what the voice is to our fellow men. He hears them, in fact, far more clearly than men hear our voices, and it is enough for him that we form these desires. For, as the psalmist says, he knows even the mere intention and disposition of our hearts from the first moment that they begin to turn and to move towards him. And this, by the way, is very consoling to you in the present state of your soul. But a still more efficacious way than any other is to bear patiently darkness, dryness, coldness, and weakness. This sad state is the specific remedy employed by God to suppress natural activity by reducing us to our own nothingness. Without this we should never be able to overcome it, because the inordinate activity of our powers cannot be regulated until, by constantly reiterated efforts, we force them to act only under the influence of the Spirit of God, and by his grace, and never of themselves, or by themselves. You see how blindly and unjustly we act when we turn the benefits of God into subjects of self-affliction and complaint, for they not only tend to extinguish our natural activity, but to kill our self-love, and to enable us to live the supernatural life of grace. Letter 9. On Excessive Fervor. To Sister Marie-Thérèse de Villeminel. On Excessive Fervor and Good Desires. My very dear sister, the desire about which you have consulted me is very good in itself, but I fear lest it may become too strong. If you wish that it may not be hurtful to you under the appearance of good, you must manage to be always submissive and resigned to it, consequently peaceful. You know how, even in our best desires, nature and passion get mixed, making them violent, restless, hasty, and wild. For this reason, and to preserve us from this danger, and also gradually purify our desires, though even those that are most saintly, God defers granting them for a long time. For the wild desires of our natural inclinations do not deserve to be answered. Only those desires formed by the Holy Spirit deserve to be heard by God, and these are always quiet, gentle, peaceful. Keep yourself, as much as possible, in a state of peace, and even of a holy joy, in order to be fit to receive holy impressions. You know that grace more easily makes way in hearts that are calm and free than in those that are full of uneasiness and trouble, for the latter are more exposed to be under the influence of the evil spirit. Letter 10. Restraint of overeagerness. To the same person. On eagerness to read good books. I send you the book on Christian hope that I promised you. I will prove a real treasure to you, But if you wish to derive from it all the fruit that I expect, you must restrain your eagerness to read, and not allow yourself to be carried away by curiosity to know what is coming. Make use of the time allowed by the rule to read it. Concentrate all your attention on what you are actually reading without troubling about the rest. I advise you all above, and to enter into the meaning of the consoling and solid truths that you will find laid down in this book, but more in a practical way than by speculative reflections, and, from time to time, make short pauses to allow these truths time to flow through all recesses of the soul, and to give occasion for the operation of the Holy Spirit, who, during these peaceful pauses, and at times of silent attention, engraves and imprints these heavenly truths in the heart. All this, however, without disturbing your attention, or violent effort to prevent reflections, but simply and quietly try to make them enter into your heart more than into your mind. Take particular notice of more of certain more important chapters, of which you are in greater need, in order to read them again when next you have time. In general, I advise you strongly not to overload your mind with readings and outward practices. It is much better to read little and to digest what you read. Just now, too, your soul is in need of unity and simplicity, and all your readings and practices should tend to a single end, and that is, to form in you a spirit of recollection. In time God will give you this grace, if you aspire to it with confidence, quietly, simply, and humbly, without eagerness, trouble, or uneasiness. Frequently ask God to detach you absolutely from all things, so that you may love and enjoy Him only, in Jesus Christ and through Jesus Christ, in fine, that He may take full possession of your heart and make it altogether His. My God, I abandon myself to you. Grant that I may desire only you. Letter 11. Intemperate Zeal. To the same person. On intemperate and indiscreet zeal. I see, my dear sister, that a mistaken zeal exposes you to dangers all the more serious because they are hidden under the most insidious appearances. Desire for the perfection of our neighbor is, doubtless, very good. Pain that is felt interiorly at the sight of his defects is good also, provided it proceeds from a pure desire for his perfection. But with all this there must needs be mingled much secret complacency, confidence in one's own superior light, and severity towards one's neighbor. Zeal such as this cannot, you must well understand, come from God. It is an illusion of the devil, hurtful to yourself and to others. However, the evil can easily be cured, provided you are sincere enough and submissive enough to recognize the gravity of it, and to apply the remedy. That which I am to offer you has already produced a very happy result in a soul which was subject to the same illusion. Let us hope it will not be less efficacious in your case. I advise you, therefore, and command you in the most sacred name of Jesus Christ, in that of his divine Mother, never more to think of practicing the virtue of zeal, as long as this prohibition is not expressly removed. I exculpate you before God absolutely, and I take upon myself the responsibility of all the ill consequences that may result from this prohibition. If you should get scruples about it, and the devil should put in your mind that you could do some good or avert some evil, say to God, My God, although charity is the queen of virtues, I may not practice this zeal until you have made me able to do so without detriment to the charity I owe to others and to myself. When I am found to be sufficiently strong, or rather sufficiently humble, to exercise zeal without disturbing the peace of my soul, and with all possible sweetness, compassion, and thoughtfulness for my neighbor, and a helpfulness, kindness, and charity which nothing can embitter, a charity which is scandalized at nothing but its own shortcomings, and with all patience and long-suffering which enables one tranquilly to endure the defects of others, and for as long as you will suffer them, O my God, and when I am neither troubled nor uneasy nor astonished that others are incorrigible, then this prohibition will be removed, and I should be able to think that I can glorify you in my neighbor. But until then, O my God, I must exercise my zeal on myself in the correction of my numerous defects. In fact, my very dear sister, when humility has dug that deep foundation indispensable for every virtue, I shall be the first to urge you to resume the practice of zeal. Until then, think only of yourself. Remember that God, to punish those who have practiced this indiscreet zeal, and to correct them, has often allowed them to fall into far graver faults than those which has scandalized them in others. In the second place, I command you never to speak of God or of anything good, unless in a spirit of humility and meekness, in an amiable and gracious manner, with moderation and encouragement, and never with bitterness and severity, or in a way to wound and repel those who hear you, because, although you may only say what is in the gospel and in the best books, I believe that in your present state of mind you might say it very badly and in such a way as only to do harm. Did not Satan make use of the words of Holy Scripture to tempt our Lord? Truth is the proper relation of things. It is changed when pushed to extremes or wrongly applied. Your peevish temper is like a smoked glass, which, if you do not take care, will prevent you seeing things in their true light, or showing them to others. Keep always on your guard against this fatal influence, and feed your mind on thoughts and feelings that are contrary to those inspired by temper. Entertain yourself and others with conversations on the infinite goodness of God, and on the confidence we ought to have in him. Compel yourself to offer an example in your whole conduct of a virtue that has no bounds, and which imposes no restraints on others. If you have nothing kind to say, keep silent, and leave the care of deciding to others. They can avoid better than you too much laxness, and will be exact without being severe. If exactitude be praiseworthy, severity is blamable. It does nothing but revolt people instead of convincing them, and embitter their souls instead of gaining them. As much as true meekness, with the help of God, has the power to repel evil and to win good, so much has excessive harshness power to make goodness difficult and evil incurable. The first is edifying, the latter destructive. Letter 12. On obedience. On disinclination to accept the comforts enjoined. Be careful never to leave off the practice of obedience under the pretext of mortifying yourself, and never forget these words of the Holy Spirit: I will have obedience and not sacrifice. Do not, therefore, hesitate to take those little comforts that the doctors, the superiors, and infirmarians prescribe for you. At any rate, you should have much scruple about refusing them. In this way you will practice a more meritorious self-denial than any bodily mortification, that which consists in the renunciation of your own ideas, of your own judgment, and of your own will. Through ignorance or forgetfulness of this truth, certain devout persons, who are strongly attached to their own ideas, commit many faults in being obstinately determined in their pretended self-denial, and extremely unmortified in their mortifications. How can they delude themselves so far as not to understand that self-love spoils and corrupts even the most holy practices? Those who renounce their own will, their own judgments, and their own ideas for the love of God will make great progress in the path of true and solid perfection. Henceforth do not make any other use of your mind and of your reason than to know what you are ordered to do, and to do it promptly, joyfully, with a great confidence in God, and an absolute abandonment to his mercy. It will all be the easier to practice this confidence when you no longer have any other ambition than to do his holy will. And, in fact, could there be a pleasanter task? Does not this divine will sanctify all its decrees? Follow it then in all things, as much in what gives you pleasure as in that which costs you most, in consolations as well as privations, working and resting, in mental and vocal prayer, in the office, at Mass, in confession and communion, in all things. Blind obedience, make no exception. It generally sacrifices its own thoughts, ideas, judgments, inclinations, repugnances, aversions, tempers, all in one word, all its own will. On this account is the sacrifice more pleasing to God than any other that could possibly be made, and without this sacrifice all else is of little value, and cannot fail to be harmful. The divine Spirit also assures us in Holy Scripture that the obedient man will gain many victories. Letter 13. On being self-opinionated, on attachment to one's own judgment. My dear sister, At last you are freed from your ties and released from all those engagements by which the world expected to keep you always captive. I do not doubt that you understand the full value of the inestimable grace of a religious vocation, and that you are disposed to accomplish generously all its duties. The longer you have waited for his grace, the greater is the gratitude you owe to him who has, at last, bestowed it on you. You must, however, be prepared to encounter many difficulties in your new life, difficulties not felt by those who embrace it earlier, but humility, renunciation, simplicity, and the holy spiritual infancy of the gospel will diminish these difficulties considerably, and will finish by making them disappear altogether. With the help of these virtues you will be preserved from a very subtle illusion of pride, to which many novices yield, and which is all the more dangerous because it is almost imperceptible. With the excuse of trying themselves better, they always want to do a little more than the rest, or to deprive themselves of those little comforts that the charity of the superiors offers them. All this is nothing else but a refined self-love, and a disguised vanity. As for you, my dear sister, never, I implore you, have any other ambition than to follow the ordinary course in all things, not one iota beyond that. Accept with simplicity and humility the little comforts and alleviations that the weak are allowed. Rejoice at seeing yourself reduced to the level of a small child, and treated like one, and take good care not to seem strong and courageous. What profound and meritorious humility will you not thus exercise, delightful in the eyes of God, and more pleasing to his heart than the most austere life chosen by yourself? What an amount of pride and vanity may be concealed in conduct contrary to this! I do not wish to hide from you what a long experience has taught me, that those who were most devout in the world before entering the religious state have generally given the most trouble to their superiors and mistresses. This comes from their having formed certain ideas of virtue for themselves, which they will not relinquish. Accustomed to be admired by all who surrounded them, and to be, usually, approved of by their directors, they cling to their own ideas and their own spirit without suspecting that this attachment is the very antipodes of true sanctity. Therefore it is far more difficult to make those persons practice humility and renunciation, to give up their notions and self-will, than in the case of young people of unformed character, or even of worldly people who have become converted. Nevertheless, if we do not become as little children, we shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. I hope, therefore, that you are treated exactly as if you were a young person of 15 or 16 years of age, equally unformed physically and mentally, and who is told, "Sister, you must rest tomorrow. You are dispensed from such and such a thing. You must take some recreation in the garden." Or, "My dear sister, that work is too hard for you. The Mother Superior will dispense you from it." While you, a formed character, formerly most devout, should, without replying by a single word or frowning, carry out all that you are told to do, to the letter, in a spirit of humility and simplicity, satisfied to be treated thus, as if you were the weakest and the least of all. Look upon yourself as such, and even rejoice at it, or at least do your best to do so. Admire the loving charity of the Reverend Mother and the sisters, and bless God for it. This is what a true interior spirit and a spirituality that is real and good should teach you and inspire you with. But it must be admitted, it is a most difficult matter to reduce those pretended devotees to this. Poor souls, blinded and deceived, the less they know how to humble themselves, the further they are from real greatness. If they would but go to Bethlehem, and there contemplate the God of heaven, become a little infant in swaddling clothes, in a manger, carried, handled, and taken from place to place, turned and touched by everyone, it might effect their cure. Let this example, my dear sister, be that which you propose to follow during your novitiate, and it is becoming like this little child that you will merit to enter the kingdom of heaven. Letter 14. On reserve with a director. To Sister Marie-Thérèse de Villemonel, on a difficulty in and a dislike to opening one's mind to a director. Believe me, my dear sister, it is necessary to struggle with all your power against the repugnance you feel to open your mind, and to regard as a most dangerous temptation the jealous susceptibility you experience when you imagine that someone has revealed your fault. It is the devil who inspires such pain and fear at having your interior miseries made known, because he knows by countless experiences that those souls that have sufficient courage and humility to disclose themselves thus, simply and straightforwardly, are speedily cured, or at least greatly consoled. He knows, too, that those wounds of the soul most frequently healed by such a disclosure can become poisoned and inflamed if not shown to the physician. In fact, nothing is more evident than that, as long as we are full of self-love, which only dies when we die, we shall be exposed to deceive ourselves as to what concerns us, and to make to ourselves a false conscience. This consideration is calculated to make us tremble, whoever we are. To avoid this danger there is only one means, and not to trust to our own light in what regards ourselves, but to allow our directors to guide our conscience, and to them we must make known with great frankness all that might serve to enlighten them. The misfortune is that even in these revelations we risk being deceived by our self-love, and also to mislead those of whom we ask advice. What is to be done to guarantee ourselves against this fresh danger? Well, those who guide us must be enlightened by others about us, and this is just what is so difficult to put up with. There are plenty of people very much inclined to exercise zeal with regard to others, who find it very unpleasant when they are the subject to it themselves. This ought not to be. True zeal should say to itself, think of yourself, and do not trouble others who are not under your care, and be very thankful that some charitable person has made known to your director what is thought about you, so that he will be better to guide you in the future. This twofold feeling is only to be found in the most perfect souls, and, perhaps, in some persons of an extraordinary natural sincerity, if but moderate virtue. Usually a zeal for instructing others is accompanied by a great sensitiveness with regard to the persons who desire to render us the same good office, by instructing our director thoroughly as to what is thought and said about us. Here again we have that twofold illusion of all ordinary devotees in the world, and also in the cloister. Examine yourself without any flattery as to this twofold matter, and enlighten yourself with considerations I have just given you. Letter 14. On Discouragement. To the same person, on discouragement. My dear sister, at this moment you are suffering from one of the most dangerous temptations that could assail any soul of good will, the temptation to discouragement. I conjure you to resist it with all your might. Have confidence in God, and be convinced that he will finish the work he has begun in you. Your foolish fears about the future come from the devil. Think only of the present. Abandon the future to Providence. It is the good use of the present that assures the future. Apply yourself to obtaining attachment and conformity to the will of God in all things and everywhere, even to the smallest things, for in this consist all virtue and perfection. For the rest, God only allows our daily faults to keep us humble. If you know how to gain this fruit, and to remain in peace and confidence, then you will be in a better state than if you had not committed any apparent fault, which would only have greatly flattered your self-love, and have exposed you to the extreme danger of being satisfied with yourself. Nothing, on the contrary, can be more easy than to make use of your faults to acquire a fresh degree of humility, and thus to dig more deeply in yourself the foundation necessary for building up true sanctity. Ought we not to admire and to bless the infinite goodness of God, who knows how to make our very faults serve for our greater good? For this it suffices to dislike them, to humble ourselves quietly about them, and to raise ourselves again with an untiring perseverance after each fall, and to work peacefully to correct ourselves. Submit the will of God as to your employments, but do not be uneasy or eager about them. Do amiably all that you know you ought to do, and depend on divine providence for success, without solicitude or anxiety, in order to have a free mind and a tranquil heart in so far as it is possible. If you are faithful in this practice, you will be able to live in peace even in the midst of disturbances, and the involuntary trouble these may occasion you will but increase the merit that is grounded on the conformity of your will to the will of God. May he be blessed by all and in all, now and forever.